Oh no, I lost track. Right as we went live. Well, he was here a minute ago. Hopefully he returns. Hopefully I didn't scare him off with the intro. Oops. Technical difficulty right out of the gate. There he is. All right, there we go. We have Drac back.
Something that Google didn't like.
Oh, okay. Well, there you go. All right, so welcome to the morning live stream. We have Drac with us. Very happy to have Drac with us this morning. And this morning we'll talk about the Canadian Navy during World War II. And no, we didn't just have canoes. Because I know there's going to be a smart button in the comment that's going to say Canadian Navy and canoes. Being that Drac is the more knowledgeable one on this, I'll let him kind of go and kind of give us a basis, and then we'll go from there.
Sure. So the very short version of the Canadian Navy is that come the start of World War II, it's actually a relatively recent service.
Yes.
It's only really started to come fully into existence during the first part of the 20th century. There's a brief surge of activity in World War I, but in the interwar period, it's really been quite run down. And actually, the number of ships it has available is actually even lower than on paper it would suggest. So on paper, you're looking at half a dozen destroyers. But if you look at the actual readiness statements from the Canadian, basically the Canadian version of the Defense Ministry in the late 1930s, about half of those vessels are actually in reserve of some description.
Yeah.
So,
and our government loving to do budget cuts didn't help matters at all.
Yeah. So then you get the outbreak of World War II, and everyone's sort of turning around going, this could be a problem. Because Canada's economy relies, especially at that stage, very much on trade. A lot of it, obviously, at that point, still trade with the British Empire, mainly through Britain. And so it becomes very evident, A, convoys are needed, and B, whether they like it or not, Canadian ships, Canadian sailors, whether they be merchantmen or warships, are going to get shot at by the Germans.
Yes.
So the Canadian Navy undergoes this kind of massive expansion, which leads to it being... It ends up in the middle of World War II in this slightly odd state as being in the top 5 navies of the world. And
by vessels, not by big boomers.
That's the thing. It's like as the Kriegsmarine and the Japanese Navy gradually diminish, it takes the number 3 spot, but never has more than 2 light cruisers. The above destroyers.
And it's funny because when you're growing up in Canada, it's weird because you go into history class or you go into things, and you'll hear about the United States Navy, you'll hear about the British Navy, you'll hear about the Italian Navy. I mean, even the Italians have a better spokesperson than we do, right? But some of the crazy things, like I've never been able to confirm or deny this. Maybe you can, but there was one story that I remember hearing from when I was growing up, that because we loved the Flower class, even though that thing almost ended up swamped every time it went across the ocean. So there was a story that when they were rolling them off the slip yards, they needed them, and there was a couple that went over and they didn't have their armament yet, but the Canadians were crazy enough to go with like wooden guns put on the ships to make it look like they had armament.
Well, the thing with the Flower class is in the early part of the war, at least, as long as you had depth charges, you were and your ASDIC system, you were probably fine, because whether or not you had your surface armament, if you ran across like a Deutschland class or a Scharnhorst, it really wasn't going to make the blindest bit of difference. The Luftwaffe at that stage hadn't really managed to stage out particularly far into the Atlantic, and so your primary threat was subs. Now, if you didn't have a surface armament, that was a little bit of a problem if the submarine came to the surface and tried to engage you.
Yes.
But even with something as small as a Flower class, submarine versus surface ship engagement is usually a losing matter for the sub. So that would explain, if you look like you have guns,
Yeah.
And a sub's going to look at you through periscope and go, well, if I stay below the surface, I have my stealth. If I go on the surface, if I even if I somehow magically win this gunfight, one hit to my hull and that's it.
I'm done. Yeah,
I'm done. So that would force them to stay below the surface, and if they stay below the surface, then they're vulnerable to your depth charges. The Flower class, I think, was I think someone typified it as a ship that would always stay afloat in any weather condition, but you would never be comfortable in any weather condition.
Yeah. It's like this isn't going to be a pleasure cruise for you, but she'll stay afloat. We think.
Yeah.
So once the Canadian Navy gets ramped up, and we, they release the purse strings, which my government doesn't like to do even now. Where is the service range for the Canadian Navy? Because I know they stretched all the way down to the U.S. coast at one point.
So what it starts out with is just your standard transatlantic convoys. But as time goes on, it very rapidly expands, because obviously you have initially you have the brief stint of the war in the Caribbean, because there's a lot of oil trade going on in the Caribbean. And to get to the UK, which is consuming much of that oil, those ships are coming up the US East Coast and then coming to Canada, usually to Halifax, to form into convoys, which will then head across to the UK. So when the German U-boats start torpedoing ships in the Caribbean, you end up with Canadian warships being dispatched there. So you then have these two centers of operation, the transatlantic hub and the Caribbean. And then once the US enters the war, or to be more accurate, once the Germans really start blowing lots of ships up off of the US East Coast, which kind of roughly corresponds to the point that the US enters the war, then you end up with Canadian ships also running those convoys. So you then have these kind of three main areas of operation for the Canadian Navy. And although the Caribbean theatre tails off a little bit as the war progresses, those are their three main areas of responsibility when it comes to running convoy escort. But it should be emphasized, I think, that just because the Canadian Navy is usually doing convoy escort, they're not just doing convoy escort, because before the war, they've got some destroyers already, and some of the later ships that they get, like Hunt class destroyers and frigates, they're on the border of, are they a pure convoy escort like the Flower, or are they actually also a small destroyer? So when those come into service, you start to see them also getting stuck in on kind of frontline or semi-frontline duties. And you, of course, have the Canadian Tribal class, of which Haida is the only survivor of the class. Period.
She is a beaut.
And those actually, the destroyers, Haida, Athabaskan, and Arcadia, and the others, they put in a lot of really good service, and they are proper frontline ships. They're not used for convoy escort much at all, unless they're part of the heavy covering forces, which they occasionally are. But usually you actually see the Canadian full destroyers operating usually in the Bay of Biscay, the English Channel. They do operate in a few other places, but a lot of it is kind of those Northern European waters, and they prove to be very, very effective in those roles.
Yeah, because you just get a couple of crazy Canucks and everything goes well. So the Canadian Navy in World War II was mainly like your smaller ships. Like we had 2 aircraft carriers on loan from the British, I believe, if I remember right.
There's a lot of there's kind of majority Canadian crewed escort carriers. The Fleet Air Arm components are still British, but that's kind of, it's a halfway house solution.
Yeah, it's kind of like, well, here's 2 escort carriers. You can say they're Canadian Navy, but but it was just, to me, it's actually amazing, because the Canadians in World War II did so much, especially even Navy wise, but we don't usually, it just kind of gets forgotten. And when I was growing up, one of my biggest pet peeves was you'd hear the British did this, and then you'd read into it, and you'd find out that it was actually the Canadians or the Australians, but the headline is the British did this.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I think that reflects there are some trends in history where they seem to forget that although the British Empire still existed in the Second World War, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, etc., they're not actually technically they kind of are part of the British Empire, but also not politically. And it's a big distinction. I sometimes have to point out to people is that in World War One, when Britain declared war, the other the colonies, if you like, they didn't really have much of a choice. For the most part, they had to go to war. Even if there was a bit of paperwork to fill in. Whereas in World War II, they had a choice. They were their own completely separate political entities at that point. If they didn't want to go to war, they didn't have to, but they chose to instead, which obviously was of a great help. But and unfortunately, that means that people who have that kind of view where everything is just the British Empire, they tend to just lump in Canada,
they lump
Australia,
in
South
all
Africa,
the
New Zealand.
colonies.
Like, it's all British stuff.
No, wait a second. But the other thing too is I always one thing you mentioned, and I think it was your last dry dock. One of the live streams you were mentioning, and I didn't even know this, so maybe you can expand on it. I didn't know the Canadians were in the Pacific with the British fleets.
So when you get towards the end of the war, I mean, there's always a small presence on the Canadian West Coast, for obvious reasons. But it's not particularly large because there aren't German U-boats on the West Coast, and for better or worse, the Japanese submarine service doesn't seem particularly interested in operating off either the Canadian or the American West Coast. So, but once you get into the latter stage of the war and you have the British Pacific Fleet being deployed, there's so little of the Kriegsmarine left. And by late 44, 45, most of what's left is hiding away in the Baltic or in harbour, and the RAF is having great fun dropping tall boys on them. The Italians have long since bowed out of the war, and so basically the only real threat that's left, major threat that's left in 44, 45 in European and Atlantic waters is U-boats, which obviously the Canadian Navy is still doing a lot of work with that. But their larger fleet units, like the two light cruisers and some of their other ships, when the British Pacific Fleet says, right, we're heading off to fight Japan, because the Canadian and Australian navies and the New Zealand Navy have subordinated themselves to Royal Navy Command for the duration of the war, when they're drawing up lists of shipping to head out, some of the Canadian ships just get told, well, I guess you're going as well.
Guess what? You get to go on an extended trip.
Which does cause a few interesting little issues with some ships, particularly one of the cruisers, because a lot of the crew had signed up for what's called a for hostilities only term. So, because obviously normally if you sign up for the Navy, you can either make it your life career or you can sign up for a specific stint of time. But at the start of the war, no one knew exactly how long the war was going to last. But the people you were fighting at the beginning of the war were the Germans. So people were signing up on kind of for this for hostilities only, which was basically, we'll fight as long as there's a war. If the war happens to be 6 months or it's 5 years, whatever, we'll stick around for it. But then when you get towards the latter part of the war, initially, obviously, Germany's still in the fight in 44, but then come 8th of May 45, she's out. And you've still got May, June, July, and a bit of August before the Japanese give up. And during this whole period, a lot of Canadian sailors are going, well, when I signed up for this, I signed up to fight Nazi Germany. And in the first half of that sort of British Pacific Fleet deployment, there's no German ships in the Pacific, so what are we doing here?
Why are we here?
And then once Germany surrenders, it's like, well, Germany is actually out of the war completely. Now, technically speaking, the war is, by that stage, it's against all of the Axis.
Yeah.
But from a lot of the crew's perspective, one, they didn't sign up to fight the Japanese. Two, they don't know how long this war with Japan is going to go on, because obviously no one at this point knows about the atomic bomb. So everybody's planning for a kind of Operation Olympic, Operation Coronet, Operation Downfall, these big landings in Japan. They're scheduled for 1946, and nobody knows how long it's going to take to grind Japan down in a land war, other than it's probably going to take a while and it's going to cost a huge amount of lives, especially considering the Japanese have got like suicide everything. They've got suicide submarines, suicide missiles, suicide planes, suicide boats, suicide people, like everything you could imagine. That in military hardware terms, that they've made a suicide version of it.
Well,
and rightfully, I think to a certain extent, some of the Canadian sailors are just sort of turn around and go, "We didn't actually sign up to fight for this. If you want us to, then that's a separate matter, and that's a subject to talk about. But you can't just turn around and say, "Oh, you volunteered to fight the Germans. Guess what? You're now fighting the Japanese for another 2 years." Especially since some of these guys had been, they'd been at war at that stage for pushing 6 years. And maybe now looking at maybe having to fight for 8 years. That was probably pushing
and not only that, but they've survived the Atlantic, they've survived the war thus far, and survived Dieppe, survived D-Day, survived all that, and then it's like, oh, by the way, we're doing D-Day Part 2 in about 6 months. Say what now? I could see that being a little bit of a no.
There
is a distinction with the Canadian Navy that maybe you can explain a little bit better than I could. So we had two branches of service. We had the Canadian Navy proper, and then we had the Merchant Marine, which to this day still doesn't have a lot of its flowers that it deserves over World War II. Could you maybe go into what those two services were, the difference? Because they both served kind of wherever they were needed, but
so you've got it's the Navy is the easy one. That's the active warships. They're the HMCS, insert name here. Heavily armed, directly under the command of admirals. The Merchant Marine is kind of this slightly more difficult thing to explain, because you have, like you have in Britain, there's a Merchant Marine, Canadian Merchant Marine, and unfortunately, sometimes the terms get conflated, because a lot of the time people use Merchant Marine as shorthand to mean merchant ships flying the flag of X country. Which isn't actually the case. You can have a ship that's registered to fly the flag of a country. That doesn't mean it's part of its Merchant Marine. And to different extents, depending again which country you're in, Merchant Marines can be more or less affiliated directly with the government. I mean, the Canadian Merchant Marine, British Merchant Marine, American Merchant Marine, they all have some kind of federal administration and affiliation, but exactly how far, how much oversight the government has over them varies on a country by country basis. There's a whole slew of things that can come with it, again, depending on the country. So mail ships, for instance, might serve, these days a completely obsolete concept because it moves by plane, but back in the day, a mail steamer would be part of the nation's Merchant Marine, and that would receive certain subsidies for its operator from the government, but in exchange it might have different constraints put on it. So ships might be designed, they might have a design in place to allow them to mount deck guns in the event of war, or they might be on a shortlist where, in time of war, the government has the absolute right to requisition this ship into some form of auxiliary service, or to direct the flow of traffic. So even if it stays completely a merchant ship, maybe with a defensive deck gun for anti-U-boat work or something, the government can still say, right, you are going, in time of war, you are going to sail from here to here with this cargo. Whereas if you're a purely independent merchant ship, you have to be chartered, you have to be paid or persuaded to sail on that route, and you don't necessarily have to. So it's a weird kind of it's not quite military, but it's quasi-military in as much as the government has a certain amount of direction to do and a say over what you do.
Yeah, they're not. They can't go. Oh, I'm not going there. I've heard there's 5 submarines. I'm not going that way. Stuff it. Whereas the merchant marine, it's you go this way. Oh yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Buckle up, boys. It's gonna be a long day.
Yeah.
So, in your opinion, and I know your time is short, so I don't want to kind of ramble too much.
Still got a fair bit.
What would be if you had to pick the most 5 major events that the Canadian Navy did in World War II? What would, in no particular order, what would they be?
I mean, in no particular order. There's an absolutely fantastic encounter that the Royal Canadian Navy ship has in the Caribbean with a U-boat, where they end up actually capturing it briefly. They end up capturing a bunch of the crew. They end up getting a bunch of fairly important information off of it. But it's an absolutely fascinating encounter to read about, because they basically end up, through various shenanigans that's going on, they end up in the middle of the night ramming this submarine, and they know they've found this they've got this U-boat to the surface, but it's all happened in the matter of a few minutes. So there are people still waking up from the general alert when they're alongside this U-boat, and they've got this boarding party ready to go, but the contact is relatively brief and fleeting. And of course, it being the Caribbean, and the Canada as a whole not really being known for its tropical weather, and neither is the Atlantic. So the Flower class don't have things like aircon. So the Canadian sailors are sleeping in little to nothing just to try and stay cool. Alert comes in, and they're just like, well, stuff it. We haven't got time. They just grab weapons and ammunition. And so the German sailors who are trying to get off of their U-boat and trying to scuttle it at the same time are confronted by the sight of 2 basically naked Canadian sailors. And the only things they're wearing are grenade harnesses and bandoliers of ammunition, and waving guns around. Which it persuades them to it persuades the Germans to do what they're being told fairly quickly.
Yes. We found a crazy bunch.
Yeah. And then when the sub goes down, one of the sailors who is actually trying to get Enigma codes and stuff off of the sub. He ends up in the water. He gets pulled out of the water by a US anti-sub escort, which has also been operating in the same convoy. Except they've just hauled out this, basically naked but otherwise heavily armed guy from the water. They have no idea who he is, and he no uniform. He can't prove who he is.
Markings. Yep.
Yeah, so they're like, okay, well, we're going to put you in the brig because we think you're part of the crew of the U-boat, which is logical because they've just seen the U-boat sink. Yeah. And the guy's like, no, I'm Canadian. And they're like, yeah, okay, so you're a German who can speak English. That's it. That nice one, whatever. And then he just lets loose with about a minute of uninterrupted, unrepeated invective, just swearing at them, and they're like, yeah, there's no way any German knows that much foul language.
Yeah, and then probably midway through, just put the exclamation point on it, he'll switch to French. Well, our broken French.
Yeah, which I mean, so that's always a memorable one. You've obviously there's also Hyder's famous encounter, well, several encounters with German destroyers off of the Bay of Biscay and so forth. Obviously, she rescues the crew of Athabaskan when that's hit and sunk, but she also proves her mettle in taking on multiple German destroyers, 2-3v1 and winning.
Yeah,
which is quite the feat. So I think those are the 2 that stand out. Like if you say Canadian Navy, those are the 2 incidents that stand out immediately the most to me. But I think probably the others are, I would say, probably mostly going to be U-boat Wolfpack battles, which makes it a bit more difficult to pin down because when it's Hyder versus German destroyers, or it's this particular Flower class, these are single ship incidents. But when you get to some of the big convoy battles, you'll have 3-4 more Canadian ships, sometimes with a Royal Navy ship or 2, sometimes with a US ship or 2, so it becomes less. Although the Canadian Navy is the majority part of that battle, it's less kind of this particular ship. It's more the Battle of Convoy X.
So I think it would be safe to say, in that general sense, the Battle of the Atlantic, the subwar, because I've said it for years, and I'm no historian, but I firmly believe that if the Canadian Navy hadn't just stepped up, I don't think World War II would have been able to happen.
Well, it certainly wouldn't have gone the way it did very easily, because and again, this kind of comes around to something I do try and point out to people, is that, and I usually intend to apply this to the free navies, the Free Polish Navy, the Free Greek Navy, Free French Navy, etc. But I think it also applies to the Royal Australian, Royal Canadian, etc. navies, and not just necessarily their navies, but also their armed forces generally, which is that not taking anything away from what the British Army, Navy, and Air Force did, but Britain was basically throwing everything they could at the problem. So you had the pre-war corps, then all the volunteers, then the volunteer reserves, but then there was also conscription pretty much from the word go.
Yeah,
and that meant that you had people who were very highly motivated in the British Armed Services, you had people who were fairly motivated, and you had people who basically didn't want to be there, but they'd been given this conscription letter, so here they were. And that leads to a mixed variety of quality across the board. Whereas the free navies, especially, but also with something like the Canadian Navy, they didn't get conscripted guys being thrown onto the ships for quite a while, which meant that a lot of the although obviously the Canadian Navy was small to start with, a lot of guys showed up were either volunteer or volunteer reserve, and there was a reasonably large body of those. And then once you got in kind of 40, 41, etc., you still had a lot of people who were volunteering because they wanted to be there. And that meant that you're starting from a base point of everyone who's on that ship actually wants to be there. They've invested in this. They've had to pass a certain degree of physical, mental, and intelligence examinations to get on there, and so they tend to work very well.
As opposed to somebody who doesn't want to be there and is there.
And you see this reflected across the board. I mean, when you quite often see in various theatres of operation, Royal Navy admirals, especially if you're looking at 1940, 1941, and into 1942, which is that's when the Royal Navy is taking the heaviest losses, and also they're kind of there's a little bit of a lull where wartime production hasn't quite gotten there to kick out the vast numbers of ships that would come about in the mid-war and late war. And at that point, you actually see a number of Royal Navy admirals specifically requesting, I need so many extra ships for this role, and they'll say, can I specifically have Canadian, or if they're in the Med, the Australians, but they'll specifically be requesting Canadian ships quite often. Because they know that there's loads of Flower class and River class, etc., being made available in the UK, but they've got very variable crews. You might get one that's absolutely fine. You might get one that's more of a liability for its first few voyages until the crew gets knocked together. Whereas if they request a Royal Canadian Navy vessel, they know that they can say, right, okay, in the case of the Atlantic, get in the convoy formation. You're on point duty. And they know they'll get on with it.
They don't know they get the job done. As opposed to, do we have a ship that is committed, or do we have a ship that is half committed and half, why am I here?
And you see that across the board. Royal Canadian Air Force and the Canadian Army as well have a similar reputation. Especially the Canadian infantry have an absolutely fearsome reputation for much of the war. But it holds true in the Canadian Navy as well. Plus, of course, you have a lot of very useful local knowledge, because you've got not just got regular sailors, but as I said, you've got both the reserve and the volunteer reserve, which are two slightly different things. But you've also got the actual full-on volunteers, people who had no naval association beforehand, but are now coming in to the service. And a lot of those are fairly experienced seamen. So they might be fishermen, they might be merchant sailors.
St. John's, Newfoundland, New Brunswick, that kind of area.
Yeah. And they'll have spent a lot of time on the Canadian coast and also trading up and down with the US coast, which means that when they're stuck in convoy escorts and told, right, you need, there's U-boats coming, but this convoy is, say, coming up from Bermuda heading to Halifax, and they're going over ground that they've gone over hundreds of times for years and years and years. They know where the shoals are, they know where the deep water is, they know where the towns are. And it's that kind of home field advantage. Because let's face it, if you take a bunch of guys who volunteered from Liverpool or Manchester in England, and you tell them, okay, we're escorting this convoy up the US East Coast to Halifax, they'll just be like, cool, lands that way, seas that way, as Dick says this. Whereas a Canadian ship would be like, okay, well, we're coming up to this shoal, and this shoal's really shallow, so it's really unlikely you take a U-boat here. So at this point, we need to concentrate all of our search out on this quarter, because that's the deep water. If I was a submariner, that's where I'd be coming from. And the convoys are then able to shift its resources to better accommodate the reality of the situation.
Yeah, it'd be the same thing as a Canadian ship in the English Channel kind of theory.
Yeah, and that's why when you do get a lot of the Canadian destroyers and so forth being assigned to British formations, you tend to have a few, 1, 2, maybe 3 of them assigned to a larger flotilla.
Yeah,
because then you have the advantage of the experience of the local knowledge of the British sailors, combined with the fact that a lot of the time the Canadian destroyer crews tend to be incredibly aggressive. It's kind of let them off the leash and follow and pick up the record and see what happens.
There was an Australian historian. I had to laugh because he was talking about World War I, but this kind of fits. He goes, in my experience of researching the Canadian Armed Forces during wartime, the easiest way to explain it is during peacetime, Canada says, I'm sorry. During wartime, you say you're sorry. The other thing that really is fascinating, especially once you get over to the East Coast, is the amount of defenses that they put up in St. John's, like the netting, and just how much they feared Germans. I mean, even growing up, you hear the stories, and it's never confirmed, and it's never, there's no proof, but the Germans got as far as the St. Lawrence, right? There was this rogue submarine that somehow got into, and it's like, really? But you hear these stories growing up here in Canada, and you just kind of go, there's no way. there's just no way.
I mean, apart from anything, it's like you're not getting on the Great Lakes in a U-boat.
No,
by heading up the St. Lawrence. I mean, theoretically there are ways, but you're not going to sneak a U-boat through the various locks that you have to get through. Someone's going to notice.
Somebody's going to notice. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there are. I suppose it depends how you define the St. Lawrence. I mean, if you say the mouth of the St. Lawrence, the harbors and everything, then there's occasionally a U-boat or two will get past the outer harbor defenses and work its way into there. But frankly, the targets that the U-boats are interested in are in the harbors or out at sea. They're not on the river. And a U-boat that found itself on the river, I mean, apart from the fact that there's nowhere near as much depth as there is off the continental shelf, so diving is a bit of a problem. U-boats operating on rivers would have other issues, like the difference in buoyancy between fresh and salt water, the constant current, the fact that if they did somehow manage to pull something off, it would be very evident very quickly, and you're in a very, very confined environment where you're not going to have much chance to escape.
You're not going to be able to turn that sucker around real quick. But it just always amazed me at some of the stories that would float around, and I'm sure
Mm.
you have them in Britain
Yeah.
as well. It just, like I told you about the one where, they're like, yeah, we were just crazy enough that, yeah, we just put wooden guns on the ship and went across. It was good.
Yeah.
Give us our liquor license and we're good to go. Um, so we had the Flower class, the destroyers.
Mm-hmm.
What other ships were by say middle of World War II are we looking at when it comes to the Royal Navy? It's just the Flowers, destroyers, and maybe a cruiser or two.
Yeah, so you've got Uganda and Ontario, which are these sort of last generation Royal Navy light cruisers. They're kind of mid to late war acquisitions. I think they both come into Royal Navy service in 43 and then get transferred to the Canadians in 44 in preparation for the Pacific. So they only really feature under the Canadian flag really in the Pacific campaign. That there's not really a lot to say about them in the Atlantic. You do have those two escort carriers, as you mentioned, that are basically manned by Canadians with the exception of the Fleet Air Arm crew.
Yeah.
You have the destroyers are kind of split because you've got the big tribals and some of the other more modern ones which are sent, which are on frontline duty. You also have a bunch of older destroyers, but they're still operating on convoy escort duty. So a bunch of the Wicks and Clemson classes destroyers, the 50 that the Royal Navy gets early on, a bunch of those end up under the Canadian flag. And they're the Wicks and Clemsons that are traded with the US, they end up in some really weird roles. You get some that are basically completely refitted for convoy work. You get some that are rather implausibly attached to the English Channel for anti everything operations, anti-invasion, anti-e-boat, anti-submarine, etc., etc. I don't think there were any Canadian ones involved in the Channel Dash, but some of the Clemsons did end up actually under Royal Navy auspices going on the Channel Dash, which is just incredibly stupid to me. It's just like they're the not quite the oldest, but some of the oldest destroyers the Royal Navy has, and you throw them at the Sharn horse.
Let's just send a motorboat. Why not?
Yeah. So then you've got obviously there's the frigates and the corvettes, which are all part of your anti-submarine effort. There's also a rather unsung minesweeping flotilla. Although flotilla is probably a very inadequate word. There's several dozen of them, and that's very important because at the harbors for the convoys at either end, you do have to do a lot of sweeping for mines. At the British end of things, you've got aircraft as well as submarines trying to drop mines. On the Canadian side of things, you will occasionally have a German submarine that tries to drop mines. And early in the war, our merchant raiders and so forth will be trying to drop mines in various places. And also the Canadian minesweepers are another branch that actually sees a degree of frontline action. I mean, obviously, you're not taking a minesweeper up to fight enemy warships one-on-one, but a minesweeper is a minesweeper is a minesweeper. So if you're going to be doing operations off of, say, the D-Day beaches or various operations in the Mediterranean against Italy, you're going to grab every operational minesweeper within reasonable distance, and he's like, right, you're going to go and make sure this beach or this harbor is clear of mines. There's also some MTBs and MGBs, motor torpedo boats, motor gunboats. They end up again scattered all over the place. Some of them end up seeing some fighting as well, and then you have smaller convoy escorts, even smaller than a corvette. You also have a bunch of Canadian manned landing craft. So again, frontline action, not against warships, but in amphibious landings. For obvious reasons, when you've got the D-Day beaches, you have an entire beach that is Canadian.
Yes.
So there's Canadian ships offshore, there's Canadian manned landing craft.
In the Canadian history, the one we don't talk about much, Dieppe, because that was a cluster among clusters.
Yeah, that's not anyone's finest hour, unfortunately.
No, it wasn't.
Yeah, and then there's a whole slew of auxiliaries, which is often the underappreciated thing. When you're bringing a convoy in, you've got to think, you've got your convoy, your merchant ships, you've got your convoy escort, which, corvettes, frigates, maybe the odd destroyer, maybe an escort carrier later on in the war. But then as you're getting into the harbor, you've got your harbor defense nets. Well, you need harbor defense net ships to open and close those. You've got the minesweepers to keep the area clear. You've got pilot ships, you've got tugs, you've possibly on the eastern side of things, you've got anti-aircraft defense ships. You've got tenders to service all of those ships, because the Canadian harbors aren't necessarily designed to have dozens and dozens of auxiliary craft motoring around, keeping the harbor safe and enclosed. And all of that has to be done by some kind of vessel.
Yeah. So I know at the beginning of the war, if I read and if I remember correctly, the Canadian Navy would take the convoy so far, and then the British Navy would take over. Did that stay the same way? Stay the same way throughout the war, or did that slowly go? The Canadian Navy goes further and further and further and further to the destination.
Yeah. So when it comes to the convoys, by the time you get to the mid to late war, you have basically you have three major groups of convoy escorts. You've got the close escorts, and they, by 41, 42, they will actually sail with the convoy the entire distance.
Okay.
So if you're going Halifax to Liverpool, that escort will be going Halifax to Liverpool.
Okay.
You then also have what they call the mid-ocean escort groups. And those are the ones that will usually be based in a single port, and they'll be coming back and forth.
Gotcha.
And you have those based in Canada, you have them based in the UK, and sometimes based in Iceland as well, because that's nice, not quite halfway, but close enough. And what they will tend to do is they will come in and escort the convoy through the area that's judged to be the area in most danger.
Where the wolf packs are usually prowling and that. So
because you might think with the harbors are obvious choke points. That's where the submarine should be. But the thing is, they're so obvious. There's lots of small anti-sub ships and obviously land-based aircraft that can cover those. And you've gradually got this narrowing mid-Atlantic gap.
Yeah, the air gap.
And exactly. And so that's kind of the major danger area. So these mid-ocean escort groups, they will pick up the convoy, they'll escort it for that section, and then they'll drop off. Usually they'll pick up a convoy coming the other way.
Yeah.
And that'll kind of return them to their start point. And then the last one you've got is, they have various names as the war goes on, but basically they're hunting groups, and they're much more of a mid to late war innovation. The ironic thing is that at the beginning of the war, the Royal Navy, by losing HMS Courageous, rather spectacularly proves that taking 3 or 4 destroyers and a fleet carrier is not a way to hunt U-boats.
No.
But by the time you get to mid to late war, sort of late 43, definitely into 44, 45, you start having what are effectively the same concept, except now it's centered around an escort carrier or two, with half a dozen to a dozen dedicated anti-submarine hunters, and they're using intel from various code breaking efforts to go around, and they're actually nothing to do with the convoys. They're actively hunting U-boats on known transit and gathering points. So, and there's Canadian involvement in all of those, but the other thing you've got to remember is that quite often, especially when it comes to the mid-ocean escort groups, or the dedicated, through all the way through escorts, they tend to be, for the most part, either majority or entirely from a single navy. Okay, it just makes things easier.
It makes
so if there's a US, if there's a US group, it'll will be almost entirely or completely be US Navy vessels. There's a lot of British only groups, but there's also a fair number of groups that are either entirely Royal Canadian Navy, or they might be 80-90% Royal Canadian Navy with maybe a single British or American ship thrown in there as well, just to make up the numbers.
Yeah, because it's easier for command. Who's got
Yeah.
the? Because then you, otherwise you get the pecking order of, well, we're the British Navy or we're the American Navy, so we have command. Well, you're just a frigate. Go away.
Yeah, yeah, and everyone also has different hunting styles.
Yes.
So I mean, obviously, different captains, different commanders, different flotillas will have their own methods, but the sort of the underlying, this is how you hunt submarines 101, is taught very differently across the different navies. There's more commonality between the Royal Navy and the Royal Canadian Navy for obvious reasons, but there are still differences. So if you had a 50-50 British Canadian split, you would notice a certain difference in hunting tactics, which could be a problem, because if one lot's doing one thing, one lot's doing the other thing, there may then be a gap in the convoy which a U-boat could exploit. Whereas if you have a 6-ship escort and 5 of them are HMCS and 1 is HMS, well, the HMS is going to have to fall in line with everyone else.
Yeah, it's like, well, they're all being aggressive, I guess I have to be too. So with and you know, in trying to prep for this stream, I was really dumbfounded by how little, like, if you type into YouTube Royal Canadian Navy World War II, there is very little useful information. One of the most useful ones was yours.
Yeah.
You know,
the funny thing is that was very definitely a summary. But there is information out there, but as you say, it's rather difficult to find.
Yeah, because you know, I'm always dumbfounded by how we need to fire our spokesman because he's not doing his job. I'm just saying. But it was you know, you get bits and pieces here and there. And then some of the stuff you look at and you're like, there's no way that that's true. And then you look it up and you go, yeah, no. And then, you know, so it's, I mean, there are opinions out there all, and of course everybody has theirs, but you know, opinions very rarely matter. You know, from the Canadian Navy was influential to the Canadian Navy was you know, didn't matter if they were there or not. Where would you put them?
I would say they're incredibly influential for 2 reasons. One of which is that, and they're kind of related, but I mean, given that the majority of the Canadian Navy's efforts are to do with the U-boat campaign, that's kind of where their greatest influence lies. But it comes down to 2 things. One of which is that it's just, apart from anything else, it's sheer numbers. You know, if let's say you need 6 escorts to ensure a good escort for a normal convoy. So if you think, right, well, take your usual thing of, you know, you usually have a ship in service, a ship in refit, and a ship that's either going to refit or coming out of it. So you know, the rule of 3, you need 3 ships to have 1 on active duty. So if you've got 6 ships that you need for a convoy escort, that means you need 18 ships to get to have that escort. So if you require 18 ships to be in service in some way, shape, or form to have your convoy being escorted, now multiply that up by how many convoys you want to escort at any given time. This is why there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of escorts, because you might have like over 1,000 frigates and corvettes in service, but at any given time, maybe only 300 or 400 of those will actually be sailing, doing their job. And everything else is preparing to do that or getting repaired from the last time they did that. And that's not something that, you know, that's not something that the British can afford to do. You know, they don't have that many people to do it. And B, they don't have the shipyards to be able to produce that many ships that quickly. And C, they don't have the skilled sailors. You know, because as we were mentioning earlier, the difference between a volunteer or someone who's skilled in sailing versus, you know, someone who's been dragged off the street and told, congratulations, you're in the Navy now. And what it means is that you've got the Canadian Navy and the what it's able to provide for the Battle of the Atlantic. It means that more convoys can sail, and more ships survive, which means more supplies reach the UK, and that keeps the UK in the war. Without the Canadian Navy, you would have fewer ships. Either you'd sail the same number of convoys and the U-boats would get more of the ships, or you'd sail fewer convoys with adequate escort. But either way, it means a lot less stuff is getting to the UK. And whilst the UK was never quite on the ropes the way it was in late 1917 when it comes to the U-boat campaign, a lot of that is because they are able to have these really valuable, large, very numerous allies sailing around helping them with their escort work. So that's a very influential aspect of it. The other influential aspect, which is related but not exactly the same, is that it allows the Royal Navy to focus on other things, because you could make an argument, and I have seen some people do this, that, well, if the Royal Navy had prioritized building escorts over everything else, then they could have had an escort fleet as big as the Royal Navy and the Royal Canadian Navy combined. And yes, technically that might be true. But as I said just a minute ago, the British shipyards only go so far. So if the British shipyards are just dedicated to building corvettes and frigates, that means we're not building new aircraft carriers, we're not building new cruisers, we're not building new submarines, we're not building new destroyers, we're not building new landing craft. And without all of those, the Royal Navy's ability to project power and combat the enemy suffers hugely. Yes. Because you're left at that point with just your pre-war ships, and as soon as your pre-war ships start getting sunk, you have a steadily diminishing pool of those, and eventually you run out of ships. This is kind of what the Japanese found out. So by dint of the Canadian Navy existing and in the numbers that it did, it meant that the British could focus on building other ships which would also help them win the war in different theaters.
Yes, and I think too. Oh, sorry.
The only other thing I was going to mention was that there are some stages, especially early on in the war, when training is ramping up, where some months the British are producing more ships than they can actually crew when it comes to escorts, and later, and this crew shortage is one of the big problems, and that's where you see a lot of ships are built in the UK, transferred to the Canadian Navy.
Yes.
So it's not just that the ships are operational, it's the ships are operational 6 months, 10 months before they would otherwise have been operational, which means, half a dozen more convoys get escorted. And plus you've got the output of the Canadian yards themselves.
I wonder if you could also make the argument that if the Canadian Navy isn't there, then the British surface fleet is impacted, because it won't be able to contain the Kriegsmarine surface fleet for what it was, as well as it did, because they would have to use those resources to shore up the difference.
Yeah, well, exactly. And I mean, and that comes down to just the sheer numbers. If you have to put your fleet destroyers and everything on convoy escort, then if you don't have destroyer escort for your cruisers and battleships and carriers, then you can't deploy them, because you now don't have anti-sub cover for those. But the other thing is also, again, as the Japanese, the Germans, and the Italians all found out, you can't run a navy if you don't have fuel.
Yes.
And Britain has a great many natural resources. Oil is not one of them.
Yes.
I mean, we did have the North Sea oil fields in the Cold War, but we didn't know that we had oil in the North Sea at that point. And to be honest, even if we did, the Germans probably would have bombed the platforms anyway. And as we mentioned right at the start, the Caribbean and US oil production were very important. So it's Canadian ships a lot of the time that are escorting those very valuable oilers up from the Caribbean and the US up to Canada and then across to the UK. And it's that oil that's keeping the British war machine going. Because if you don't have the oil, you don't have the ship fuel. If you don't have the ship fuel, then you can't deploy your ships, you can't fly your aircraft, you can't drive your tanks. And with the Luftwaffe on the other side of the channel for a good chunk of the war, that's going to put you in a very bad position.
Yes, then all the dominoes kind of fall and you're in trouble. So I guess as we're getting close to the hour, what would you say, if you're rounding it out to sum up the contribution of the Canadian Navy to the war effort.
Mm-hmm.
How would you sum it up?
I would say the Royal Canadian Navy's main contribution to the war effort is they are a huge part of what enables the Allied war effort in Western Europe to actually exist. Because, you know, as a British person, whether you like it or not, Britain did not have the resources to fight Germany, Japan, and Italy and keep itself supplied for all of that, all on its own.
No.
Something had to give somewhere, unless you can get friends to help you. And for the first 2.5 years of the war, whilst the US does have these neutrality patrols going on, the US is not officially involved in the war. They can't actively shoot back at the U-boats. And it's those opening years that pretty much are critical. The big convoy battle that is usually said to be the turning point of the Battle of the Atlantic happens in early 1943. But that, by inference, that means that 75% of the really critical, dangerous portion of the Battle of the Atlantic happens before the US gets involved. And at that stage, the only people really who are helping the Royal Navy in any great numbers to keep Britain supplied and keep the war effort alive is the Royal Canadian Navy. With that, you know, it's an alt history scenario, so we can never say exactly how far it's gone. But you know, if the Royal Canadian Navy hadn't have been there, then it's possible that elements in Britain that wanted to have a negotiated peace with Hitler in late 40, early 41 might have won out, because they might have been able to project to tables and go, look, well, we physically can't keep ourselves in this war. And you know, I dread to think what Europe would have looked like if we'd thrown in the towel then and said, okay, Hitler, you can have Europe for the next decade. Because if we had, you know, America would have focused on Japan first before they did anything with Europe. And that's a scenario that is. And the only other thing I would say is something that sometimes people miss a lot. You know, there's Churchill's famous speech. You know, we'll fight them on the beaches, we'll fight them on the land, and all that. Okay, people tend to miss the last bit of that speech. And I'm trying to remember it. I may have to paraphrase slightly because I can't remember it completely offhand. But he does say words to the effect that he says, even, which I do not believe for a moment, if this island or a large part of it was subjugated, then the British Empire, armed and guarded by the British fleet, would carry on the struggle until in its good time the new world steps forth to the rescue and deliverance of the old. I think that's like 90% of what he said.
Yeah.
Now I'd ask everyone a question. When Churchill said that, and the Royal Navy did have plans for that, where do you think the Royal Navy was going to go?
Yeah, Canada. It's the same.
They ain't sailing to Australia.
Same place they tried to get the king to go. And the king went new. But we are at our hour, and I don't want to keep you too long. But I want to thank you again for joining me here and enlightening us on the Canadian Navy. It was great to talk with you. Hopefully I didn't fall too flat on my face, and and hopefully we can have you back again. And I will say that, because my better half in chat pointed it out earlier, because I'm wearing my Alabama hat. She lives in Mobile. So she gets to look at the USS Alabama every day. And then couldn't figure out why I went crazy when I went down there. But with that, folks, I'm going to say thank you. If you haven't checked out Drac's channel, please do. He is awesome. He does dry docks that never seem to end, but you don't want them to, so it's all good. And with that, folks, thank you very much. Have a good day. We're out of here.